What if I told you that one of the most famous wars in history didn't last 100 years, but 116? A war so devastating that entire regions were left abandoned. A war that transformed kings into legends, peasants into heroes, and a teenage girl into one of the most famous figures in human history. For more than a century, two powerful kingdoms fought for power, glory, and the right to wear a crown. Millions suffered. Thousands of villages disappeared. And by the end, Europe would never be the same again. This is the story of the 100 Years' War, a conflict filled with betrayal, epic battles, political intrigue, and incredible courage. Let's begin. The year was 1328. Europe looked very different from the world we know today. Modern nations did not yet exist in the form we recognize. Kings ruled vast territories, noble families controlled immense wealth, and loyalty often mattered more than nationality. At the center of our story were two kingdoms, England and France. Although they were separate kingdoms, their histories had become deeply intertwined. For centuries, English kings had owned lands within France. These territories were inherited through family connections and marriages between royal houses. This unusual situation created tension. Imagine being a king who ruled England but also possessed valuable lands inside France. Who should have authority over those lands? The English king? Or the French king? This question would eventually help ignite one of history's longest conflicts. When King Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a male heir, a succession crisis erupted. Suddenly, there was a huge question. Who should become the next king of France? One candidate was Philip of Valois, a cousin of the deceased king. Another was Edward III of England. Edward believed he had a legitimate claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella, who was the daughter of a previous French king. However, many French nobles rejected this claim. They argued that the French crown could not pass through a female line. As a result, Philip became King Philip VI of France. At first, Edward accepted this decision. But beneath the surface, resentment continued to grow. Neither king realized that Europe was slowly moving toward a conflict that would last generations. By the 1330s, relations between England and France had become increasingly hostile. Disputes over territory, trade, and political influence intensified. The wealthy region of Flanders, located in present-day Belgium, became particularly important. Its economy depended heavily on English wool. Both England and France wanted influence there. Tensions reached a breaking point in 1337. King Philip VI confiscated territories belonging to Edward III in France. Edward saw this as a direct attack on his rights and authority. In response, he revived his claim to the French throne. War had begun. Neither side could imagine how long the struggle would continue. Most people expected a short conflict. Instead, they were witnessing the opening chapter of a war that would stretch across generations. Families not yet born would eventually fight in battles connected to this dispute. At the start of the war, France appeared stronger. Its population was much larger than England's. It possessed greater resources and more soldiers. Many observers assumed France would win quickly. But reality turned out very differently. England possessed a weapon that would change medieval warfare. The English longbow. Unlike traditional bows, the longbow could shoot arrows over great distances with tremendous force. A skilled archer could release several arrows in the time it took a crossbowman to fire one. Years of training gave English archers remarkable effectiveness. Soon, this advantage would shock Europe. In 1346, Edward III launched a major invasion of France. His army moved through the countryside, destroying property and challenging French authority. Eventually, French forces caught up with the English near the village of Crécy. The French army greatly outnumbered the English. Confidence filled the French ranks. Many knights believed victory was certain. After all, they represented one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. What could stop them? The answer came in the form of thousands of English longbowmen. As the battle began, French forces advanced. Wave after wave attacked English positions. Then the arrows started falling. The sky seemed darkened by countless projectiles. French knights and soldiers were struck before they could reach the enemy. Chaos spread rapidly. Horses panicked. Formations collapsed. Attacks became disorganized. Again and again, the French charged. Again and again, they suffered devastating losses. By the end of the battle, England had achieved a stunning victory. Cressy demonstrated that heavily armored knights were no longer invincible. Military history was changing. The age of the knight was beginning to decline. While armies fought, an even greater threat approached. A disaster that cared nothing about kings, crowns, or kingdoms. In 1347, a deadly plague entered Europe. Today, we know it as the Black Death. The disease spread with terrifying speed. Victims often died within days. Entire families disappeared. Villages were emptied. Cities became places of fear and death. Historians estimate that millions of people perished. Some regions lost nearly half their population. The war temporarily slowed as both kingdoms struggled to survive. No army could defeat the plague. No castle wall could stop it. The Black Death changed Europe forever. Labor became scarce. Economic systems shifted. Social structures weakened. Even as the war continued, society itself was being. Despite the devastation caused by plague, conflict resumed. In 1356, another major battle occurred near Poitiers. This time, Edward III's son led English forces. He was known as Edward of Woodstock. History remembers him as the Black Prince. The French king, John II, personally commanded a large army. Confident in their numbers, the French prepared to crush the English. Instead, they faced another disaster. The English once again used superior tactics and disciplined archers. French attacks failed repeatedly. Confusion spread across the battlefield. Then something extraordinary happened. King John II of France was captured. A reigning monarch had become a prisoner of war. The news stunned Europe. Capturing a king was almost unimaginable. For France, the humiliation was enormous. For England, it was one of the greatest victories in its history. Following the disaster at Poitiers, France entered a period of crisis. Political instability spread throughout the kingdom. Heavy taxes angered ordinary people. Nobles competed for power. Peasant revolts erupted in various regions. One of the most famous uprisings became known as the Jacquerie. Frustrated peasants attacked noble estates and symbols of aristocratic authority. The violence reflected deep social tensions. For many ordinary people, the war meant suffering rather than glory. Fields were destroyed. Homes were burned. Food became scarce. Bandits roamed the countryside. While kings argued over crowns, common people paid the price. Yet despite all these problems, France refused to surrender. The kingdom endured. Its people adapted. And slowly, conditions began to improve. In 1360, both sides agreed to the Treaty of Bretigny. The treaty granted England significant territories in France. In exchange, Edward III temporarily abandoned his claim to the French throne. For the moment, peace returned. After decades of fighting, many hoped the conflict was finally over. Markets reopened. Fields were replanted. Families attempted to rebuild their lives. But the peace remained fragile. The underlying rivalry between England and France had not disappeared. It had merely been paused. Both kingdoms continued preparing for future struggles. Neither trusted the other completely. And before long, war would return. Even more fierce than before. During this period, France gained an important leader. King Charles V. Unlike many medieval rulers, Charles understood that wars were not won only through dramatic battles. They were also won through strategy, patience, and administration. Charles reorganized the kingdom. He improved finances. He strengthened government institutions. Most importantly, he avoided unnecessary risks. Rather than seeking one decisive battle, he focused on gradually weakening English control. His strategy worked. French forces slowly recovered territory. English dominance began to fade. The balance of power was shifting once again. The story of the 100 Years' War was far from over. In fact, some of its most dramatic chapters had not yet happened. The arrival of a legendary king, a civil war within France, and a young girl who claimed to hear divine voices would soon change history forever. As the 14th century came to an end, France faced a dangerous problem. The enemy was no longer only England. The enemy was also within. King Charles VI of France suffered from periods of severe mental illness. At times, he could not govern effectively. Sometimes he failed to recognize members of his own family. On certain occasions, he reportedly believed he was made of glass and feared that he might shatter. With the king unable to rule consistently, powerful noble families competed for control of the government. Two factions emerged: the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Both groups claimed to be acting in France's best interests. In reality, they were fighting for influence, wealth, and power. Soon, political rivalry turned into open conflict. Assassinations occurred. Cities chose sides. Violence spread across the kingdom. France was sliding toward civil war. And England was watching closely. Waiting. Looking for the perfect opportunity. In 1413, a new king ascended the English throne. His name was Henry V. Young, intelligent, ambitious, and determined. Henry believed he could achieve what previous English kings had failed to accomplish. He wanted to secure English dominance in France. And perhaps even claim the French crown itself. Unlike many rulers who merely dreamed of glory, Henry acted quickly. He organized an invasion force and prepared for war. In 1415, English ships crossed the English Channel. The 100 Years' War had entered a new phase. One that would produce one of the most famous battles in military history. Henry's campaign did not begin smoothly. After capturing the town of Harfleur, disease weakened his army. Many soldiers became sick. Others died. Supplies ran low. The English army was exhausted. Most commanders would have returned home. Henry chose a different path. He decided to march across northern France. French forces quickly mobilized. They intended to trap and destroy the English army. As Henry's men marched through muddy countryside, a massive French force moved to intercept them. The stage was set. Soon, both armies would meet near a small village called Agincourt. October 25, 1415. A cold and rainy morning. The battlefield was narrow and covered in thick mud. The English army was heavily outnumbered. Some estimates suggest the French had 2 or even 3 times as many soldiers. Many French nobles were confident. They expected an easy victory. After all, their enemy was tired, sick, and vastly outnumbered. But they made a critical mistake. The muddy terrain limited movement. When French knights advanced, they struggled through deep mud. Heavy armor made movement even harder. Meanwhile, English archers prepared their longbows. Then came the arrows. Thousands upon thousands of arrows. The French advance slowed. Men slipped and fell. Crowded formations became trapped. Chaos spread rapidly. The battlefield turned into a nightmare. Those in the rear pushed forward while those at the front struggled to move. The result was catastrophic. The French army collapsed. Thousands were killed. Many noblemen were captured. English losses were comparatively small. Agincourt became one of the greatest victories in English military history. Across Europe, people were stunned. How had a smaller, exhausted army defeated such overwhelming odds? The answer lay in leadership, discipline, tactics, and the effective use of the longbow. Henry V had become a legend. After Agincourt, English fortunes soared. Henry continued his campaigns in France. One city after another fell under English control. French resistance weakened. Political divisions made coordinated defense difficult. In 1420, a major agreement was reached. The Treaty of Troyes. The treaty contained astonishing terms. Henry V would marry Catherine, daughter of the French king. Even more importantly, Henry would become heir to the French throne. The treaty effectively disinherited the French crown prince. For England, it appeared to be a dream come true. After decades of war, ultimate victory seemed within reach. The English king might soon rule both England and France. But history rarely follows a predictable path. Just when English success seemed unstoppable, disaster struck. In 1422, Henry V died unexpectedly. He was only 35 years old. The same year, Charles VI of France also died. Suddenly, both kingdoms faced uncertainty. Henry's heir was an infant. Henry VI. A baby king. Meanwhile, supporters of the French crown prince rejected the Treaty of Troyes. They proclaimed him King Charles VII. Now, two rival kings claimed legitimacy. The conflict continued. The future of France hung in the balance. At one point, it seemed entirely possible that France might disappear as an independent kingdom. Then an unlikely hero emerged. A teenage peasant girl from a small village. A girl who would change history forever. In the village of Domremy lived a young girl named Joan. Today she is known as Joan of Arc. According to her own testimony, Joan began experiencing visions and hearing voices. She believed these messages came from God and instructed her to help save France. At first, few people took her seriously. She was young. She had no military experience. She came from a peasant family. Why would powerful nobles listen to her? Yet Joan possessed extraordinary confidence. She traveled across dangerous territory seeking an audience with Charles VII. Eventually, she succeeded. When she met the future king, she convinced him that her mission was genuine. Exactly how she achieved this remains one of history's mysteries. But somehow, she gained support. And soon, she would lead a mission that seemed impossible. By 1429, the city of Orleans was under siege. Its fall would likely open central France to English conquest. Many believed the city could not be saved. Joan disagreed. Carrying a banner and inspiring those around her, she joined French forces moving toward Orleans. Her arrival electrified the defenders. Morale soared. Soldiers who had been discouraged suddenly felt hope. Over the following weeks, French forces launched aggressive attacks against English positions. One by one, key fortifications fell. Then came the breakthrough. The English siege collapsed. Orleans was saved. For the first time in years, France had achieved a major victory. The psychological impact was enormous. Joan had become a symbol of national resistance. Many began to believe that France could actually win the war. Joan's successes continued. French forces advanced. English positions weakened. Joan insisted that Charles VII should be crowned in the traditional city of Reims. This was risky. The journey passed through dangerous territory. Nevertheless, the expedition moved forward. Remarkably, many towns opened their gates without resistance. Momentum was shifting. Finally, Charles reached Reims. There, in July 1429, he was crowned King Charles VII of France. The ceremony carried immense symbolic importance. It strengthened his legitimacy. It inspired supporters across the kingdom. And it demonstrated that French recovery was possible. Joan had helped achieve what many considered impossible. Despite her achievements, Joan's story would take a tragic turn. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian forces. Rather than being treated as a conventional prisoner of war, she was handed over to the English. A trial followed. Joan was accused of heresy and other religious crimes. The proceedings were highly controversial. Many historians believe the trial was politically motivated. Joan defended herself with remarkable intelligence and courage. But the outcome was largely predetermined. She was found guilty. In 1431, at just 19 years old, Joan of Arc was executed. She was burned at the stake. Witnesses reported that even some of her enemies were moved by her bravery. Her death shocked many people. The English hoped her execution would weaken French resistance. Instead, the opposite happened. Joan became a martyr. Her legend only grew stronger. As the years passed, France continued to recover. Charles VII implemented important military reforms. Instead of relying solely on temporary feudal forces, he developed a more professional army. Artillery became increasingly important. Cannons improved dramatically. The nature of warfare was changing. Castles that had once seemed invincible could now be destroyed by powerful gunpowder weapons. French armies gradually recaptured territory. English strongholds fell one after another. The momentum that England had enjoyed earlier in the war began to disappear. The balance of power had shifted permanently. In 1453, one last major battle took place near Castillon. This battle is often considered the final major engagement of the Hundred Years' War. French artillery played a decisive role. English forces attacked well-prepared French positions. The result was a disaster for England. Their army suffered heavy losses. Their commander was killed. Any realistic hope of conquering France vanished. The war was effectively over. After 116 years of conflict, France had emerged victorious. England retained only a small foothold on the continent. The dream of ruling France had ended. The 100 Years' War changed Europe forever. It transformed military strategy. The dominance of heavily armored knights declined. Professional armies became more important. Gunpowder weapons grew increasingly powerful. The conflict also strengthened national identity. People began thinking of themselves more strongly as English or French. Loyalty to a kingdom became more significant than loyalty to local nobles. Governments expanded. Tax systems evolved. Centralized states became stronger. In many ways, the foundations of the modern nation-state were being laid. The war also elevated legendary figures whose stories continue to inspire people centuries later. Henry V. The Black Prince. Charles VII. And above all, Joan of Arc. A teenage girl who altered the course of history. Conclusion. The 100 Years' War was never truly about a single crown. It was a struggle for power, identity, survival, and legitimacy. Generations were born into the conflict and died before it ended. Entire regions were devastated. Millions experienced hardship. Yet from the destruction emerged a new Europe. When the war began in 1337, the medieval world seemed permanent. When it ended in 1453, that world was changing rapidly. Kings rose and fell. Empires dreamed of greatness. Heroes became legends. And one of the longest wars in human history finally came to an end. More than 6 centuries later, the story of the 100 Years' War remains one of history's greatest tales, a saga of ambition, courage, tragedy, and transformation that reshaped the destiny of nations forever.